pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial birth.
Hey Elon, quiet. I'm trying to podcast. Can't you see? Can't you see? Take a moment away from plotting world domination and just stay still. Be a Cunis. Is that correct? A little bit of Irish there for you. Cunis means quiet. Be a Cunis. Be quiet. Anyway, look. Apologies for the late delivery of the podcast today. I had some problems with my initial recording, which was about politics and sort of looking back at the state of the world last year. The usual white boy with a podcast thing to do, looking back over the year. But the sound was corrupted. Perhaps the universe is trying to tell me something to just not bother. Does the world really need your view on the politics of the world when we can kind of see it's all a bit fucking crazy? Anyway, I'll try and re-record it, and you might get to hear some of that nonsense next week. So, I've had to fall back on a, well, not really fall back, but the unexpected adventures surrounding the Primordial album Storm Before Calm, which was our fourth album, which we recorded over in Bradford in the early 2000s. It's perhaps one of the most underrated albums, perhaps the most underrated album in our canon, whatever you want to call it. But it's a kind of interesting look back at a snapshot in time that's almost 25 years old, 23 years old or whatever it is. Some odd and mildly amusing stories surrounding the recording of the album and that kind of thing. So sit back, relax, and listen to me talk about the fourth Primordial album, Storm Before Calm. And let's try and renew normal service next week, my friends. All right, Agitators Anonymous, let's have a listen to this one. Well, seeing as recently I did post a full album stream of our fourth album, Storm Before Calm, on YouTube, maybe I should have a little update, a little conversation about it. I could check and see, did I, 210 episodes ago, talk about Storm Before Calm? But maybe it's worth having a little discussion of once again. Because my feeling is it's sort of one of the most underrated Primordial albums there is. It almost didn't get made, and it has a very odd story. Because back in those days, back in the 90s, we made our first album in Rama in 94, and we left it what seemed like a long time back then, until 1997, to record our second album, Journey's End. And we went to Academy Studios in Yorkshire. We actually went to Academy Studios in Yorkshire, the old Academy, and that's going to become quite an important fact as the story progresses. But the old Academy, which was where Paradise Lost recorded Gothic, My Dying Bride recorded Symphonaire, and all those early albums as The Flower Withers, Anathema did Pentecost 3 there, Solstice did Halcyon. Loads of great old productions came out of that studio. And so it was kind of iconic, and Primordial always had quite a lot in common with those bands like Anathema Liverpool, Anathema, My Dying Bride, Paradise Lost. We had a similar kind of gloomy, gothic, earthy kind of edge, doomy sort of view of the world, which was more in common with those bands than perhaps, Norwegian black metal, even though Primordial, of course, had a black metal side to it as well. I mean, obviously. However, the old Academy Studios was a really unobtrusive house in just a normal housing estate opposite Bob's Chippy. Bob subsequently died of eating his own produce. So you can imagine what sort of greasy spoon Bob's Chippy was. It acquired legendary status, really, I suppose, and was heart attack inducing. But it was a kind of unobtrusive house. Downstairs there was one small room with bunk beds where you could stay. but a really cool live room, which is downstairs with old kind of creepy black and white cameras, surveillance cameras, which linked the control room upstairs to downstairs. It had a really unusual atmosphere and had a really strange kind of feel to it. And it was something that I think was really conducive to making great albums. The atmosphere was very inspiring, and the environment around in I guess Bradford, Dewsbury, which is a sort of satellite town of near Huddersfield and Yorkshire and that kind of thing. Pretty gloomy place, to say the least. You weren't going out on the piss there or going out to see the sights. Pretty gloomy working class area, but the studio itself was inspiring, and we had made Journey's End there, and we'd end up staying there for almost 3 weeks or something. Now, the albums after that, after we made Journey's End, we were pretty determined to try and kick the band on. We made the Burning Season EP and Spirit the Earth Aflame, but we made those albums in Dublin, in Sun Studios, which is a great basement studio that still exists in Dublin. It's where actually I made the VERMINOUS SERPENT album. In one take, in one day. But it has that's another really good underground kind of studio in the Dublin city centre. But Academy it just had this reputation, had this atmosphere. And when we came to make our fourth album, Storm Before Calm, we probably should have known there was some shadows moving in the background of this album. Hammerheart, the label we were on at the time, the Dutch label, were, unbeknownst to most of the bands on it, about to go into a kind of solvency, into bankruptcy. Not really going to get into the politics of that, but we were promised X amount of studio advance money, and only by the good grace of Mags and Keith, who owned the studio, Keith Appleton, who you can see played keyboards, for example, on Paradise Lost Gothic, and I think he recorded Lost Paradise as well. And Mags was his assistant. Anyway, Keith just allowed us to keep going because they knew us and they liked us, but they could have pulled the plug on us before we even started, because, as you obviously know, you don't start something without paying your deposit. But our deposit was not paid. In fact, half the studio ended up being paid just about when we finished our first step of the recording, but certainly we weren't allowed to bring any master tapes home because the second half was not paid, and it took a long time for it to get paid. So we made a record and we never brought it home or were able to bring it home to listen to. But I'm not here to really discuss the economics of the bankruptcy of Hammerheart Records. Let's discuss Storm Before Calm. What we didn't realise is that when we booked into the Academy had moved. That old house had been sold, and we thought we were going to get something similar, atmosphere-wise. But in reality, Storm Before Calm was recorded, I suppose, in what would be the kind of the outhouse or the extension of Keith Appleton's normal house. So it wasn't residential anymore. In fact, we had to stay in some empty hotel, which was, creepy enough as it was. But there was no real drum room, and there was no amps. It was just like a really, really functional, simple, small, a little bit more like studios can be now. But we'd never recorded in anything like that. And we'd never had to record without the ability to make feedback, to stand in the room and rehearse together. It was basically a digital studio, and we had never recorded with that. So the album has an unusual feeling to it. We did the best we could to try and make it sound more analog, more real. But you can hear on this record, this is about as digital as Primordial ever got. And we didn't really understand what was going on. It was the first album, first thing we'd recorded that wasn't on old analog tape, where you had to, you had the old tape machine, you had to rewind it and cut yourself in to, drop yourself in to make changes. This was digital, so also everything could be quantized and moved. It was not really our style to move things into time, but this was our first experience with a full digital recording, and you can hear it. I think we did our best, like I said, and I think our songs like Cast to the Pyre, it adds a certain kind of feeling. But if you take, which I think is one of our, which is a really underrated song on this record, but you take Heretic's Age and the leading powerful snare in the blast, this is a very unusual sounding song. it should, as an analog recording, it would sound much more black metal. But in the end, this very powerful snare kind of overrides everything. Sons of the Morrigan, for example, on this album, is more of a rock song, really. And it does swing and groove. And of course, we recorded with real drums, but they weren't, it wasn't a proper live room. Like I said, we had no amps. But again, we did not know what we didn't know what to expect. And so we were trying to cope the best we could with our limited songs. The hosting of the She was Kieran's idea to put this W.B. Yeats poem to music. He had this idea for the music. And realistically, we only really had 7 pieces of music. And Fallen to Ruin is a very good example of a song that was kind of put together almost digitally, with when it breaks down and you've got the wind and me screaming in the background. And we were able to do things like that and put them together as we were working in a way we'd never been able to do on other albums. Now, I don't know whether that's good or bad. I'm in two minds, really, because I think if we took those songs and recorded them now, it would feel they would feel very different. But it's an album that some people really, really like. In fact, I know a couple of people who's their favourite Primordial album. I'm not sure about that. Certainly, I think it's the most underrated. I think there was a kind of conflict going on with me with the lyrics. You take Cast of the Pyre is a very dark, gloomy song about resignation and defeat. But then you've got Heretic's Age, which is really defiant. What Sleeps Within, which is a very black metal song. This is a very second wave black metal song with a total black metal voice. So there was still a kind of, I think it's a harder record than Spirit Through the Flame. I think it's a more aggressive record. I think it's harder hitting and it's got more harsh dynamics. But I'm not sure whether that's just because it was digital. Like if you listen to the blast beat on Glorious Dawn, the snare is lost. But yet if you listen to the blast on Heretic's Age, we made sure the blast was out on top. Now if you ask me, a blast beat should be led by the snare, not by the bass drum. And that was a great bone of contention between me and Kieran as we move forward into other records with Traitor's Gate, for example, Unto the Nameless Dead. He always felt a blast beat should be led by the bass drum. I the other way around. So could the album have sounded a little bit more rounded, a bit richer in the tones? Because don't forget, you're recording digitally. We had no idea about pods or inputs or amp sort of digital reconstructions of amps which we were being forced to plug into. We'd never experienced anything like that. We just still had our guitars and a bag of pedals and expected to plug into an amp. So Kieran had to kind of cope manfully with the idea that how do you contour the sound? How do you make dynamics? It was the first album that had a kind of semi-distorted bass tone. This is really down to me because I was the only person left there mixing it. And my natural inclination is to always put some snarl in the bass. My perfect bass tone is probably Motorhead, 1979, 1980. I don't think, and I've talked about this on lots of podcasts before and lots of episodes of everything to the point everybody's bored with hearing me talk about it. But I think one of the problems with modern heavy metal production is that the frequency range is just too maxed out. It can be too much, and guitars are just too heavy. And that drums and bass should occupy that mid-ground. The guitar should be pushed wider, and guitars should have two very different tones. Somebody was asking me to write an article about this late, which is really odd as a singer, but when you hear Millet, Creator's guitar tone from the 80s, Possessed, Megadeth, Dave Mustaine, James Hetfield, Piggy from Void, as soon as you hear the bands, even the feedback of Tom Dewar, that's Tom's tone. Because his amp, pedal, guitar setup, and the way they were mic'd up and the way they were recorded are all individual. And that all got removed. And that if you're recording a metal album, you should have two completely different setups for the left and the right. If you've got two different guitars, you shouldn't just change the head and change a couple of things. Now, I've fought very hard to try and have that in Primordial, but it never quite worked out as much as I wanted it to. And obviously, I'm not the guitar player, so I don't have the final word on tones and stuff. But my feeling is that you should be totally set up differently, even mic'd differently in rooms. One should be close, maybe. Listen to Hanneman and King on Hollow Eights. I understand it's a lost art, but imagine how lost it is when you walk into the studio to record, as we were Stone Before Camel, and go, oh, there's no amps. So you can have all these different artificial choices, but yet at the same time you can't smell it, you can't feel it. There's no movement of air between the heads and the cabs and the speakers and stuff. It kind of threw everything into a kind of state of turmoil. We also weren't staying in the studio, and at this stage I was completely nocturnal. I was going to sleep usually between 5 and 7 or 8 in the morning, which of course, when you have a studio time where you want to start at 10 or 11 in the morning, was like very difficult for me. So I would end up sleeping on a couch under like 3 duvets in the drum room beside while the drums were being recorded. The whole situation wasn't really ideal, and it wasn't a studio that had really any atmosphere. I mean, it was a kind of stopgap studio, and I think quite a few bands, you know, if you were My Down Bride, who I'll speak about, you could record there and then go back home and stuff. Speaking of My Down Bride, at the time we had no money because none of the money had come through to record the record. We had no money to hire a drum kit. So Sean, who was the drummer of My Down Bride at the time, who didn't know us, by the way, was just asked, could we borrow a drum kit? Drove it down in his van. Not only gave us his drums, gave us everything we wanted, gave me and whoever else a key to his house, so we had somewhere to stay, because we also had no money for accommodation. They found basically a sort of empty hotel that was related to somebody in the studio, who gave us like one room for like dirt cheap for like 2 weeks. But because I stayed on for the mixing, so without, you know, the kind of help of My Down Bride at the time, I think the album might not have even happened. I don't know where we're going to get a drum kit from. And we, you know, this is 2002, so don't forget we're all pretty poor. I don't imagine any of us came to record the album with more than 50 or 100 pounds in our pockets. And we certainly didn't have credit cards and this and that. Whereas also Primordial hadn't really started to... We'd done a couple of tours of Europe. We just got a couple of festivals, but we weren't a staple on the festival circuit as we are now or became. We're still trying to make our mark. And of course, we're trying to make our mark with this important record following on from Spirit, the Earth, the Flame, which was a big step upwards. We're trying to do this being hamstrung by a label who were on their way out and who weren't really telling any of us and who hadn't paid for the studio on any level. So I think we got the ferry across to like Liverpool and got the train down to the studio, and we arrived and they said, by the way, you've got no money, which of course now you could exchange in an instant message or something. But back then, for whatever reason, we didn't know we were traveling without any budget. I presume that it was just expected it would arrive at any moment. But, you know, fair play to Mags and fair play to Keith. They just kept on, they let us plough ahead until eventually some money arrived. But we weren't allowed to leave with our album. We recorded it. I think we had to wait 2 or 3 months before we actually heard it afterwards. And I was left to mix it on my own, which is, as a singer, I think sometimes when you're a singer, if you have a good ear, you get a good overview of everything, of all the tones. You're not listening necessarily for the guitar, for the bass, for the drums, as you might be if you're playing those instruments. I think you can get a good overview if you're clued into tones and sounds. And so I would do things like alter a little bit the guitar tones here and there. But at the same time, you're mixing digitally. And you're mixing in a small room where you're not used to hearing things a certain way. So, considering all of those things, it's quite a miracle that Stone Before Cam turned out to be the kind of record that it is, which I think it's a strong record. It's a dynamic record. It's shorter. It's to the point. It doesn't fuck around as much. It's got some interesting dynamics, and I think it's pretty heavy. It's pretty aggressive, but there is something missing, tonally. It's missing a certain richness. It's missing a certain separation, of course, because we really sort of didn't know what we were doing. And then, of course, we get to the artwork. So I would admit to being underprepared for the artwork, but we went over to work on the artwork in the Hammer Heart Studios, and we're super under pressure. It was basically like, hey, this needs to be mastered this weekend. Can we do the artwork today, this afternoon? Will it be finished tomorrow? And we just didn't have access in 2002 to the array of, let's say, now you can go online and you can get interesting free folders of arts of like wood engravings and all that kind of thing. And that's not really where my head was right then. Like the changed artwork which you find on the new version, is exactly how it should look. This was a kind of like not a lithograph, but what, I'm not sure what you call it, what you call exactly those drawings. And I found it at a flea market in Edinburgh, and I thought, look at this, a beautiful pen and ink drawing. This should have been the cover. But I was underprepared. I think we kind of assumed that the artist, the in-house artist, who had no ideas either, or really much of a grasp of trying to make it look very professional, and sort of came up with something on the spot, which was based on a tattoo that was on my arm. Or was it the other way around? I can't remember. At the Eye of Lugh, which is like the, or the Eye of Balor, or whatever you want to call it, which is like the sort of evil eye in Irish mythology. And it was just sort of sold to us very quickly. We had a couple of hours and they were like, here, what about this? Look at this, look at this, look at this. And it looks cheap. It looks terrible. It looks horrible. It's a really nasty looking CD. There's some people who like it, but I think they're just being nostalgic and romantic because it's the pre-changed one. But it's a poor looking record. In the band pictures, we had to cut and paste Simon in because he wasn't there for the band photos for whatever reason. Everything about the album was kind of undercooked, from the label to the artwork to the studio to our preparedness. But I can't say that the songs are undercooked. I still think when I listen to it now, when I listen to Cast to the Pyre, I think this is an excellent song. I think Sons of Morrigan is a banger. This is a a dance floor filler, as they say. It's a toe tapper. Heretic's Age is a very aggressive, defiant song with a big chorus that I same with Fall Into Ruin. Actually, it doesn't have a chorus. What am I talking about? Fall Into Ruin does. And it also has a new kind of vocal for me, which was this kind of brutal guttural vocal, which I'd been edging towards with Spirit, the Earth, the Flame, but it hadn't really happened yet. I was still singing quite clean compared to the way I sing now. And this new voice kind of comes out on especially Fall Into Ruin, and that sort of was a new signpost on the way to somewhere else vocally for me, which was very important. And I think listening back, I'm still super proud of the album. Could it have some more separation, some more dynamic tones? It could, but then it might have just ended up sounding like Spirit, the Earth, the Flame. Maybe the harsh tones gives it a certain impact, because certainly it starts out of the gate just impactful. Like we were like, no fucking around, no big long 2-minute windswept intro. Let's bang, 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 bang. Let's just go for it. And if you do look at it, you do look at this reimagined version with the new cover, and you go, all right, it makes much more sense. It sits in much more nicely. Nicely. Come on. All those years of studying English and you can't think of a word than nicely. Well, it's an underrated record. We did a poll on our, some Facebook poll, and I think it came in like second or third last of all 10 albums as voted for by people. But the people who voted it as one were very specific. They were like, yeah, this is the one. This is my favourite. It's an underrated album that I think, I don't think there'll be much clamour for people to go, oh, why aren't you playing this album front to back, as we are going to start doing that next year. But a modern take on this album with, a big live sound could be very interesting. Storm Before Calm is maybe the most underrated album we made. It's certainly the most, I'm not going to say misunderstood, because that's not true, but the fact that it actually exists. This is the album that almost never got made. If Academy had been a bit more cynical, had been a bit more, hadn't been less understanding, had been less just good people that they were. Keith and Mags, of course, were brilliant people, so understanding of the situation we're in, but they didn't pull the plug on us. And so, kind of, we owe it to them that the album exists. Certainly not to Hammer Records, and we owe it to My Dying Bride for bailing us out with some gear when we kind of had nothing, especially the drum kit. And there you go. Maybe it's time to go and take another listen to Storm Before Calm. All right, my friends.